Hi, I'm Gary Wockner. I'm the host of Overcoming Overshoot here on EarthX TV. And today we are with Laurel Hanscom, who is the CEO of the Global Footprint Network. Their website is footprintnetwork.org. And that website's actually very important because they have a lot of information on there, as well as tools that we're going to talk about and use during our show today. Footprintnetwork.org. Thanks for being on today, Laurel.
Thank you so much for having me, Gary.
I thought we'd kind of do three things. One, right at the beginning, and one is sort of define the word overshoot. Like, what do we mean by overshoot? And that's important because your Twitter handle is @overshoot, and this show is called Overcoming Overshoot. So we're in the same business here. And from your organization's viewpoint, what does overshoot mean?
Overshoot is the term we use when we're talking about how we're using more than what the planet can renew. So every year we calculate Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day of the year when we've used all of the resources that the planet's going to be able to renew over the entire year.
Okay, and when I went on your website, there's a lot of information about Overshoot and Overshoot Day. And so let's next talk about ecological footprint. And I want to just start by, one of the images that we're going to show is like a guy, he's standing there and his foot's sticking out, but his footprint is like 1,000 times bigger than his foot. And it includes forests, it includes pasture land, rangeland, it includes farmland, it includes industries and cities and streets and roads and cars and water and the ocean and the rivers. And it's just kind of a fascinating picture that sort of tells this whole story about what a footprint is. So tell us about ecological footprints.
Ecological footprint is a land-based metric, but basically what it is doing is encapsulating in a single number how much we are taking from the planet. So everything we eat, as you mentioned, everything we eat, everything we wear, everything we use to build, all the land that we use for our cities and our infrastructure, all of that is captured in a single ecological footprint metric. And we use that because it gives us an opportunity to compare different kinds of land uses. So normally you wouldn't compare cropland to streets, right? But being able to put that into the same metric allows us to add it all up and compare it to what the Earth can renew.
And so a person can have an ecological footprint, a city can have a footprint, right. A country can have a footprint, and a state can have a footprint. And so sort of how is each of those kind of different? How do you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So because ecological footprint is in this single metric, we can do it, it's scalable, right? So it's like the same way that you could compare how much a person makes or spends in a year, you can also calculate how much a city makes or spends in a year, or an entire country. So this unit that we use is called a global hectare, and that allows us to calculate from the person to the whole planet, and those numbers are compatible.
So I went onto your website and I did the footprint calculator, and anybody can do that, and I would encourage anybody watching to go ahead and do that too. And I went through the questions it asked, and I was just going to kind of go through them here quickly.
Yeah.
It asked is what you eat, and especially how many animal products you consume, whether that's meat or dairy or cheese or eggs. And the next one is about how much, what kind of your food you consume, if it's packaged, and if it comes from a local or a faraway source. And the next one is the kind of housing you live in. And then it asks you about your electricity source at your house. So if you know if it comes from coal burning power plant, or if by chance if it comes from wind or solar. And then how much trash you make every day, which is an interesting question. What kind of car you drive, and how many miles per gallon it gets. And then also if you take public transportation, and how much you fly during a year. And so, go into those just a little bit and tell us, like, why they would trigger ecological footprint to be sort of bigger or smaller. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So everyone has an ecological footprint. We consume to live. That's how life works. We have to eat, we have to get around, we have to have shelter. So what it's measuring is how big that is compared to other things. So if we eat food that comes from very far away, the footprint associated with it is much larger because it had to travel. So it also has the embedded carbon footprint within there. If something is highly packaged and that we eat, it means that there's been more processing involved. Maybe there's plastic, maybe there's, extra steps. All of that requires energy and additional resources. Similarly, in your home, if your house is powered by photovoltaics that are on your roof, or you're lucky enough to live in a place where a large proportion of your electricity comes from renewable sources, your footprint is going to be smaller. But it might also be smaller because your house is better insulated. So being able to pull those things together and understand the efficiency of our homes all contributes to the size of our footprint. And the last thing with the transportation, how far we go every day or every year, how many flights we take, all of that goes into our footprint as well. The carbon footprint makes up roughly 60% of the total ecological footprint. So it's a major aspect, and it's something that climate activists and scientists have been beating their drums about for a long time. But it's definitely something that we can measure at the person level versus the big. We talk all of these things and at the large level about talking about countries and international bodies, but we each have a footprint too.
One of the things I was going to ask, and you touched on it, is what's the difference between a carbon footprint versus an ecological footprint? So explain that in your own words too.
So ecological footprint considers all of the different things we consume, right? So we're talking about how much we need in terms of corn or leather or wood. But carbon footprint just refers to the portion of the ecological footprint that's related to fossil fuel use. So in most cases, it's greenhouse gas inventories that measure that. And it definitely is an input. We take the carbon footprint and take it another step further and calculate how much space is required to sequester all of the carbon that we have. So we can put that in, and the idea behind that is that we can put it into the same unit so we can compare our carbon footprint to our food footprint to give us the opportunity to really compare what the earth is providing versus what we're actually taking.
Okay.
Which is what allows us to calculate things like overshoot day. Those metrics are needed for us to be able to do those calculations.
All right, so now comes a little bit embarrassing. I calculated my footprint, and I'm a little below average for American, but it's a little bit higher than I actually expected it. And I think what triggered it was probably two things. One is the amount of animal products I eat, but especially the amount of flying that I do. My transportation footprint was pretty high. And, I'm fortunate enough to be at a stage of life where I do get to travel and get to go places, but that has a big footprint on it. And is that common for an American citizen, in this country, for example? I mean, is it, what generally triggers a high footprint? Or is it big houses, small houses, coal power, eating a lot of meat, flying, driving? What's sort of the common, trigger in this country?
Well, in the United States, carbon footprint is pretty big. A lot of that has to do with, where our energy comes from, how we power our homes, and then obviously how we get around. In years like this, I guess there are not years like this, right? This is a pretty unique year. We see that the carbon footprint has dropped quite a bit because individual travel has gone down. But a big piece of our food footprint is, it's animal products. Not saying that you can't enjoy animal products, but that is something that the lower you eat on the food chain, so to speak, the more you eat like a rabbit, the better off you are in terms of having a smaller footprint. And that's, obviously these things are all really personal. I feel like it's really common to talk to someone after they've taken the footprint calculator and they're like, oh my gosh, my footprint is so large. I can't believe this. But part of that is the way that, the way our society is set up. We don't have a ton of control over a lot of the things that make our footprint large. So not everybody can put photovoltaics on the PV on their roof. Like if you're renting or, if it's too expensive, you can't put on solar. But, you know, there are different things that we can all do in our lives to manage our footprint and make sure that we're living aligned with our values and trying to move out of overshoot.
So you mentioned something I want to kind of get to here too, and that's what happened this year, which caused sort of Overshoot Day to move to be different quite a bit by a couple of weeks than it was the last few years. And so obviously we had this coronavirus economic lockdown. It was global,
Right.
and it had a big impact on climate emissions and other kinds of ecological footprints around the planet. So tell us a little bit about, a little bit about what Overshoot Day is, hit that again, and then why the economic lockdown related to the virus caused that to change.
So Earth Overshoot Day, as I mentioned, is the day of the year when we've used all the resources that the planet will renew over the entire year. Last year in 2019, it fell on July 29th. This year, it was on August 22nd, which
Okay.
means it moved back just over 3 weeks, almost a month difference, which is pretty significant. Never in the charting, the data that we've ever looked at, has a jump that big happened. And part of what we do through the campaign is talk about how we want to move the date of Earth Overshoot Day back in the year. But it wasn't like this that we had in mind, right? The suffering that came with all of that lockdown, the loss of life, the loss of jobs, the economic turmoil that it has caused has been really horrendous. It's not something to be celebrating. So, you know, if this had happened in a year where we consciously as a society decided to, you know, shift the way that we consume and lower our footprint intentionally, that would have been awesome, right? That would have been a really exciting, celebratory kind of thing. But because of the way it happened, it's been really awful. So it's sort of bittersweet in that sense. You know, we've seen a lot of the different ways that the lockdown has shifted sort of the way that we see animals in places that we hadn't previously, or at least not for a very long time. And so it's kind of, you want to be like, okay, well, maybe this is a good thing, maybe this is exciting, but if it comes at the cost of such a high cost, I mean, that's not something we're trying to accomplish.
And so, during the lockdown, people drove quite a bit less. They flew quite a bit less. They shopped less. They ate out less. And all sorts of things happened. And that caused the ecological footprint to decrease, which moved the overshoot day further in the future. So the goal of Move the Date is to get it farther into the year, right? That means we're living more sustainably longer during a year. And so that's basically what happened during the lockdown, right?
That's exactly right. What we see is, or what we want to see is that we move the date all the way out to December 31st
Right.
and beyond, right? That's the goal of moving the date. So we saw that big jump because of the sort of contraction of the footprint, but it's a very fast contraction, and it was done in sort of a unfortunate way.
Now, one thing on your website, you have a lot of going on there. One of the things is you can compare different countries. So what country consumes a lot of resources versus it's like land mass, you call it the biocapacity, versus a country that doesn't even consume the biocapacity it has on its in its boundary. So for example, if I get this right, the United States consumes about 5% of its biocapacity every year, whereas Brazil it has excess biocapacity. So it's actually below what it consumes. Is that like an accurate way to say it?
Sure. I mean, I think the easiest way to think about that is to think of this in monetary terms. So biocapacity is like our income. We have a certain amount of biocapacity in each country, and we measure this using, we do what's called a national footprint and biocapacity accounts, where we measure the ecological footprint and biocapacity of every country in the world. And that's based on lots and lots of UN data statistics on consumption patterns. So places like Brazil that have a very large landmass and lots of biocapacity are what we call ecological creditors. So it means that they have, and so again, in economic terms, right? They have more than what they're using. But places like the US and others are using more than we're actually producing as a country. And of course, that's possible because of trade, right? Trade allows us to do a lot of things, but one of the things it allows us to do is to use more than what our country can provide.
And I also noticed you can compare states. So, for example, I live here in Colorado, and our ecological footprint was again pretty high. I think it was between like 4 and 5, of the Earth's capacity. Whereas Alaska, which has a huge landmass, very few people, has a very, very low ecological footprint. And so, is that sort of a fair way to say it? And so, do you compare states like that?
It's been a long time since we've done a dedicated study to look at the difference between states. But a lot of that is related to population, right? So the population in Alaska is much smaller than the size of the state. So it makes sense then on a per person basis that the size of their ecological footprint is going to be tiny compared to their biocapacity. So I think that's another thing that's interesting to check out with the data that we provide is we always provide it in terms of how much is available total, and then also how much is available on a per person basis. So looking at, very populous countries like India compared to much less populous countries like Canada gives us different insights into what their consumption patterns are like. So even though Canada is an ecological creditor based on our data, their individual per person average footprint is actually significantly higher than world average.
That's kind of an intense term, ecological predator. I hadn't really thought of it like
creditor, not predator.
Oh, creditor. I was thinking, whoa. Well, predator.
That would be
actually
scary.
I mean, the U.S. is an ecological predator. We're out there preying on other countries and consuming their resources and sucking them towards the U.S. Is that mean to say? Or
I wish I'd thought of that term earlier. That's a really catchy one. Maybe we'll try. I'll talk to my communications team and see if we can work that in.
Yeah, talk to Com, see if they got a new PR strategy. One thing I noticed is that the United States' footprint has actually gone slightly down since 2005. Did I see that accurately? Okay, so in 2005, it was up almost to like 5 Earth's capacity, and I'm not saying it quite right, but you'll correct me. And now it's down to like 4.9 or 4.7 Earth's capacity, and that really surprises me. So what's happening in the United States that it appears that we're actually getting slightly better? I mean, or not as bad. Let's put it that way.
So the 5 you're referring to is how many Earths we would need if everyone on the planet lived like someone who lives in the United States. And so what we found over the last about decade and a half is that with the economic crash in 2008, we saw another contraction of the footprint in the US. But when it came back slower than before. So, you see the economic recovery happen. Obviously that's, now that'll change a little bit again. But as the economic recovery happened, the footprint didn't go up with quite as much, with the same acceleration, which is good news, right? We want to be able to continue to improve people's lives and give people access to healthcare and all the goods and services they need, without that also coming with additional footprint.
And so you're throwing me softballs here because I want to get to a little more controversial topic, and that's about population growth. Because since 2005, the United States has added about 30 million people. The U.S. adds about 2 million people per year on average. And so it's interesting that the footprint has gone down a little bit, even though we've added around 30 million people. And of course, at the same time, over the planet adds about it's about 80 million people a year, I think, right? It's something. There's 220 million, I think. Yeah.
And so big number.
Yeah, it's a big number. And so that is also, fascinating that things can actually go down even though we're adding a lot of people. So how do you look at that?
So I think it's interesting to talk about population because it is such a controversial subject, right? When we look at the growth of the number of humans on the planet over the last century, there is obviously this explosive growth in terms of how many people there are. And when we're looking at the data, we see our global, like humanity's ecological footprint go up at the same time. But it doesn't go up evenly, right? There are some places where ecological footprint goes up a lot, or population goes up a lot faster and ecological footprint goes up a lot faster. And it doesn't all match up. So when we talk about ecological footprint and the growth of population, it's important to contextualize it, I think. Make sure that we're talking about footprint in the context of where the growth is happening on either side.
Are there any developed countries that are doing much better than others? And I've noticed, I think Finland for example, is more green on your maps as opposed to bright red like the United States. The United States is a predator, of course. Finland doesn't seem to be quite the predator. New Zealand's kind of a light green. Australia's kind of a light green. Some of them don't. Some of them seem to be doing better than others in terms of developed countries. Is that fair?
Well, we don't like to use the word developed country. We try to stick to more descriptive terms like high income or low income or middle income. But there are places that have been more forward thinking in terms of putting into place policy that help make it easier for individuals to live sustainably. Our goal as an organization is that everyone lives well within the means of our one planet. So we absolutely want to see things like human development index metrics go up, right? Like we never want to see footprint decrease at the expense of people's well-being. So it's interesting to look at countries like that have that fall in green or red, but can be considered high income or have high human development index. But that also needs to be contextualized with how much space there is. So you think of a place like Australia, the population of Australia compared to the size of the entire country is like Alaska. It's fairly small in comparison. So sometimes that's the bigger factor than particular policy measures or sort of lifestyle choices made.
One thing, there's a quote by a guy named Bill Maher, and he's a comedian, of course. But he also says substantive things sometimes. And he was on his show one night. He was talking about how birth rates had gone down, and he said, "We don't need smaller carbon footprints. We need less feet." And so, just thinking about, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot and get you to take a hard position on population growth, but I'm thinking about, the numbers that you use and the calculations. And if you had less people, there'd be more bio capacity for the people that are there. So just let me throw out a rough estimate. There's 330 million people in the United States, and let's say we're using 5 times the Earth's capacity at our current rate. Well, if there were 5 times less people in the United States, we'd be kind of even Steven. And so population has it's the denominator, or I don't know exactly how your calculations work, but it's the denominator in a lot of the calculations you use. And so I wonder if you ever get, and again, I'll also say, like, there's only so much Earth, right? And the more of us there are, the smaller, and even if it's all perfectly equitable, the more of us there are, the smaller piece we're all going to get. And then we also got to give, at least half of it to all the other critters on the planet.
That's right.
So that they can live a life that they were intended to live too. And so I don't know, how do you sort of grapple with this issue of population in your organization?
Well, because we're a data-centric organization, talking about population, as you said, is often just math, right? It's the denominator. We look at the size of the ecological footprint of the entire United States, and then we come up with an average per person, and use that number quite a bit. So we talk about this and often in those terms of how much is it per person. So technically speaking, yes, if there were fewer people on the planet, our total footprint would be much smaller. But I think Bill Maher was only half right, because it does matter how much we consume, and it does matter how many people there are on the planet, but it also matters how much we consume if we want people to live good lives, right? We could, if there were a Thanos situation, I don't think anybody would take that. We snap and cut the world population in half. That's not a just or equitable solution, and it doesn't put people at the center of what of the idea. So I think, yeah, I mean, when we talk about population in terms of our work, often it is sort of a number, but I think it's really important to keep the solutions and like the actual population change thoughts at front and center, because population is a slow moving thing, right? Making changes now is going to have a biggest change a generation or two down the line. We're not talking about solutions that are going to drastically cut the population of the planet. So the good news is that solutions in terms of population and sustainability are also great for human rights. So the solutions that we focus on, and I think are the only solutions, are providing access to healthcare and contraception and the ability to make choices. It's about education for girls at the same rates as boys, and making sure that men and boys are part of the population conversation when it comes to health and contraception and family planning. And all of that is a win-win, right? It's a win-win because it's good for people and it's good for families, and it's also a win-win because it's good for the planet and stabilizing the population growth that we've seen go up so drastically over the last half century.
Yeah, and let's kind of shift a little bit too, because I heard on another show you were talking about the difference between sort of wealth and success. And so, of course, in the United States, we measure success in terms of gross domestic product and how much money you make and all those kinds of things, and how much you consume and how big your house you have and how many cars you have, how big your TV is, all that kind of stuff. Whereas, New Zealand looks at it a little bit differently. It's more about well-being and happiness. The country of Bhutan has this fascinating thing called the happiness index. And so it seems like you could start to get at some of these issues like ecological footprint by just trying to change mindsets and worldviews about what is success and happiness versus what is like wealth and GDP. So how do you guys engage in that kind of debate in your organization?
Well, we're certainly proponents of the idea that living a great life does not require consumption or this sort of rampant consumerism. Good lives for all, obviously, is core to our mission. But you see things like the happiness index and human development index, sort of probably more well known. And we like to look at that in comparison to ecological footprint per person. So if you think of, for example, sustainable development as a concept, that's something that's been over the last 30 or 40 years, sustainable development has been sort of this rallying cry, especially in the last 10 with the sustainable development goals. So if you can plot countries with ecological footprint per person on one axis and happiness index or human development index on the other axis, then you have one side that's measuring, are we having great lives for all? And then the other side is saying, are we doing it within the means of our one planet? And so you find a few countries that fall into that little box of, having a high happiness index or a high human development index, and also a small per person footprint. And I think that's what we're talking about, trying to, that should be the goal. Can we have great lives and great quality of life within the means of what the planet can renew?
Yeah, and I noticed on your website, there's a program moving forward in Scotland that you're involved in. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency has a few years ago adopted this really I think, wonderful framework that's based on our data, which is called One Planet Prosperity. And essentially, their EPA is saying, as a framework, the projects that go forward, the policies that go forward, are measured against this idea: is it One Planet compatible? And so the head of their CEO of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, Terry Ahern, is doing these really amazing things, shocking the system, but really setting sort of a beacon and a North Star for what EPAs can be doing in terms of really reshaping the discussion around prosperity within the means of our planet.
That's fascinating. As I mentioned, I do have the good fortune to travel, and I've been to both Scotland and New Zealand, and both of those countries have a very different vibe than the United States. There's more of an outdoor culture, it's more of an adventurous culture, and you definitely feel just kind of a different vibe there too. It's sort of part of the cultural heritage of the countries. We'll kind of end on one note here, because I know part of your goal in trying to end Overshoot, and what we're trying to do here with Overcoming Overshoot, is to move that date. So, talk a little bit about moving the date, and how your organization is trying to engage with people. Like, are you in schools? Are you trying to deal with cities, countries? Like, just give us a little overview of how you're trying to move the date.
Absolutely. So we work with all sorts of different organizations. You talk about schools. Our ecological footprint calculator tool is used as part of environmental science curriculum and sustainability course curriculum across the country. And so probably over half of the people who come, well, half of the 3 million people who calculate their footprint like you did, are students. And so they're a big portion of who we talk to and our constituents as an organization. But we also work with, big companies. We work with Schneider Electric, which is a big company based out of France. And they're trying to end Overshoot by retrofitting and all of these efficiency solutions that their company provides. And then we work with countries. So we work with the Scottish EPA, but we also work with countries like Slovenia and Japan, and try to calculate their ecological footprint and provide additional details and analysis to help shape policy, but also to give sort of a headline indicator. The way GDP sort of gives us a high level idea of how well a country is doing from like a economic perspective. We're able to share ecological footprint data with them as well. And we talk about solutions a lot. We really think that it's important to think through the solutions. This isn't just a doom and gloom kind of situation. We think it's really important to not just focus on what can often sound like sort of scary metrics, but to say, these aren't scary metrics. This is the world that we live in. This is a starting point. How can we take what we have and shift the conversation? So we talk about solutions in terms of 5 different solutions pillars. Pillars is sort of a funny word, but I'm going to go with pillars. And the first is on sort of the income side, biocapacity, and that's planet. How are we taking care of the planet? How are we protecting our land for native species? As you said, E.O. Wilson has put this big save half for nature. So there's this part of that. Part of the solutions is taking care of our planet. And then we talk about cities, how our cities are built. Are they pedestrian friendly, or can you get around? Where our energy comes from? Is it clean energy? Is it dirty energy? Is it inefficient? And then where our food comes from, and what we eat. Did we get it locally? Did we eat lots of meat? Did we eat mostly plants? And then the last is, as we talked about, is population. How many of us there are? Because the more of us there are, the less planet there is per person. And so there are solutions that are, at every level. And a lot of that is systemic and a lot of it is individual, but really it's all of it together is what we would like to talk about in those big areas.
Yeah, that's great. If I was super wealthy, I would try to give you guys enough money so that you could force your way into the public conversation. So every year that when like gross domestic product and economic indicators were reported by the media and by the government, it also reported the ecological footprint. I think that would be a huge goal and a huge educational opportunity.
I think that would be amazing. If you know any really, really wealthy people who want to help us out with that, we should talk.
Okay.
I think it would be a great way to shape the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you for being on the show, Laurel. And I want to remind listeners and watchers that the website, footprintnetwork.org, it's really amazing. I've spent a couple hours on it just looking at all the maps and all the graphs and all the data. And my degree was in geography, like Laurel's was too. And so I'm kind of just intrigued by like all those different colors and pictures and graphs and data. And so you can spend a lot of time on the website, footprintnetwork.org. You can also calculate your own ecological footprint. And then your friends can do it, and you can like footprint shame people, which I'm sure, mine's lower than yours, that kind of thing. And you can get on social media and start shaming them about their ecological footprint, which actually happens. You see that kind of thing a lot.
It's not something we promote.
No, I know. I just went off on a tangent there because I do see that happen. Again, Laurel Hanscom with the Global Footprint Network. Thank you for being on Overcoming Overshoot. Your website is footprintnetwork.org, and your Twitter handle is @overshoot. And you all are watching EarthX TV.
Thank you so much.